Hello, everyone. So grateful that you are here with us today because we have a very special guest, Lori Mazor, who I will turn over in a moment to introduce herself. And as you may or may not know, we are doing a series around AI for business good. And we're exploring different topics that help organizations and leaders of those organizations reflect on how they can integrate these advancing technologies in a way that does good for business. So with that, I'm going to get us started and have Lori do a little introduction, and then we're going to have a dialogue about how we can do business good using AI and other advancing technologies. So please, Lori.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Jen. Really excited to be here today. And, this is such a new technology relatively for everyone, right? We are barely 2 years into generative AI being a word that everybody knows and understands, or at least can kind of recognize. And, the future is going to be both exciting and a little bit scary for people. But I've made my place in the world in the intersection between AI and creativity. I say that I teach AI with a human touch. So I bring AI into businesses and bring businesses to me to learn how to use AI tools in a way that is helpful, creative, productive, but also recognizes the importance of the humans in the loop.
Love that. And one of the things I was so attracted to you, Lori, was exactly that intersection that you described. So at Sentient, we do a lot of work helping organizations do work for creating a culture where they can not just survive, but thrive in constant change. And we do a lot of work around change management, helping organizations develop some resiliency and adaptability and flexibility. So one of the things that I most appreciated when I read your book was bringing some of these ideas that leaders can adopt to embrace creativity in a new way and really unlock a different skill set potentially with their teams. We always like to say, how can you unlock the magic in your workforce and elevate meaning and purpose at work? And I think you've got a unique perspective that I really appreciated when I read your book. So why don't we start there? I have just some questions for you, if you don't mind. And for those members who are new to your book, maybe you could just mention the name of your book, Temperature, and a little bit about what that is all about. And then I would like to have you share with our listeners your background and what led you up to creating this book, because I think you do have a really interesting perspective on how AI can really enhance and explore skill sets that may be underrepresented by people in the workplace today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book is called Temperature, Creativity in the Age of AI. And I actually started writing this book about 10 years ago. And so if I flash back to that time period in my life, I was working as a university administrator and I was overseeing design and construction on a college campus within New York City. I had a small team, but universities are like little cities. And so you have a microcosm of just about every kind of building you would ever build in your lifetime if you navigated the globe. And we were actually building in Abu Dhabi and in Shanghai and in countries around the world as well. So one of the things I started to observe was that people approach a creative problem, and I really think creativity is a problem-solving set of skills. They approach a creative problem in very different ways. Even people who have gotten the label creative will approach a problem in a different way. And I was observing that some teams would get a project brief and it would have a design objective and it would have a schedule and a budget, and they would overshoot on the design objective, achieving really incredible and unique results, but the building couldn't be built on schedule or on budget. And then we had other teams that really took those constraints seriously, but the designs were sometimes lackluster. And so I think my brain was really looking for, is there a way that we can optimize people's performance, people's creative performance regardless of how they feel about rules and structure.
I love that. And, there are a couple things that came up for me as you were talking. And the one thing was a quote that struck me right in the beginning of your book, where you say, with the image that you generated, and I won't quote it verbatim, but it went something like, the most important creative act in generating this image was neither mine nor the machine's. And so, and correct me if I am totally off there in
You got it.
and how I wrote it down and I was like, is that right? But I thought that was interesting because it does invite us to explore this with curiosity. I think we have this tendency when change happens to be like, what's happening? But this can sort of open and soften and allow for some curiosity on, oh, what does it mean to co-create? There are other examples in history where we've leveraged technologies to co-create. So how is this different? And I'm not even suggesting that there aren't significant differences, but it just let's invite the question. So around that creativity component, I think that you have a really interesting perspective around some of the stereotypes of what traditionally creatives look like. Can you share a little bit about that?
I was just reading an article yesterday, and we are using the Torrance test for creative thinking, which was developed in the 50s. Okay. So, like, just imagine the mindset in the 50s. It was developed in the 50s to measure divergent thinking, which is being able to come up with novel ideas. And we have somehow associated this with what it means to be creative. So, when people say creativity, what they usually mean is novelty. And we know that our brains don't work like that. Our brains work holistically. And there were a number of different evolutionary steps in our understanding of neuroscience. But there was a study that was done, and it looked at all of the studies that looked at our brains, right? So, like, any kind of imaging that we have of our brains as we are engaging in creative acts, and found that there is no one place in your brain that is the locus of creativity. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't specificity in different functions in your brain. We do know that to be true. There were earlier studies where people's brains were literally split in half, which was kind of a barbaric act to help people with epilepsy or other kinds of disorders. So there are, analytical tasks that happen in one place, and there are language tasks that happen in another. But creativity is a holistic process, right? And so I think for me, that's been a big eye opener. And I think we still are in this world where we divide kids into creatives and non-creatives, right? If they like, math, we send them to a STEM school. If they are artistic, we pigeonhole them into a creative outlet. And artistry and creativity are not the same thing. For me, AI is a great leveler because it gives everybody access to be able to kind of download their brain in a visual way. And, in general, none of us, unless you are a poet, right, or a novelist, we have really a terrible command of language, right? Our vocabularies are very limited. And so, one of the exercises I do with students, it starts out and I call it sketching with words. And even those folks who've been in creative industries and used to using, PowerPoint or Photoshop are, mining for language that they can use to describe the world around us. And I think it's just a really powerful set of skills because, we don't always see the things that are in front of us, right? And part of creativity in business, which we then usually call innovation, because that sounds, I think, a little bit more masculine. But part of like creativity in business is seeing the things that not everybody sees, right? They might be right in front of you, right? But you have to look behind a filter or you need to turn your head in a different direction.
I love that. And I can attest to that. I'm going to test that little image tool that you described because I have not ventured there. And I'm like, oh, this sounds really fun because I love in your book, the Marilyn Monroe bananas picture. And I thought, oh, I could probably create something interesting. But I agree that exploring some of these tools, and even with my own discovery and what we do at Sentient, just to explore different tools, has even provided me the ability to sometimes bounce ideas around, or do some accelerated research and then go back and interrogate it, or sample something, put something out there to say, I kind of want to talk about this subject with this kind of tone, but I need some ideas to get started. And it just provides a prompt where I think sometimes you may never get to actually producing something that is creative from your own mind, that is informed by your own mind. And AI can sort of give you that starting point or give you some assistance. So I love that exercise that you described. I'm going to pivot us over because I want to talk a little bit about the title of your book, Temperature, especially for our audience. We'll have a mix audience that is coming from just learning how to spell AI to maybe having been in the business of AI for years. So talk to me a little bit about temperature and what that means.
Yeah. So temperature is this really interesting parameter in AI. And if you are using ChatGPT or, any image generator, it's not going to be obvious to you that this metric exists. So it's something that if you're a developer and you're working with what we call an API, which is basically like a key to the kingdom, right? Lets you communicate back and forth with a machine. You can set a parameter called temperature. And what's interesting about it is that parameter usually goes somewhere from 0 to 1. 0 is going to give you the most probable, right? Because these are statistical machines. And so, basically temperature allows you, it's like a damper on probability. You can open it wide up to 1, and that's going to give you the most novel, the most unique responses, or you can ratchet it down to 0, and that's going to give you the most frequent, the most probable. And if you set it at 5, it's going to be halfway in between, balanced. And so this was this huge light bulb moment for me when I discovered temperature, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the system that I was studying 10 years ago, right? This was my idea about in computers, we call the space. So there's like structure and space, right? Structure is like things it's fixed. It's like mass, right? It has weight, could be literally columns in a building. Space is the thing that we fill. And in machines, that's what sometimes we'll call it hallucination, because it will, think of it like Mad Libs, right? You have like the structure of a sentence, and then you have these blanks, and the machine will fill it in with a probability, right? It might be the most frequent word, or it could be the most random word, right? Now, when we're playing Mad Libs, we want the most random word, right? Because that makes it funny. And humor is creative. So, I think that's when we have machines that are operating and like filling in the blanks with weird words, like that's operating in creative mode. That's high temperature AI. But when we want to do a search, right, we want truth, we want facts. We definitely don't want AI to be making up words that fit in the blank, right? We want the word that has usually come next in the sentence. And so there you want to ratchet it down to 0. Now, it's not always going to give you the right word, right? It's not going to necessarily give you the most truthful word, but it is going to give you the most probable word. And so that, I think, is a really interesting way to look at creativity, this balance between structure and space and where we find ourselves on that spectrum. So for humans, I think this gets back to, how do we interact with rules? How do we feel about structure? Do we feel like structure is helpful to us? Do you enjoy when you are starting out doing something, following a recipe as a method of learning? And then, what happens if you're missing an ingredient in the kitchen, right? That's a creative act. You have to perform a substitution. All of a sudden, you have space to fill it with something, right? So even recipes can be very creative. We use them in the right way. But also, if you're somebody who every time somebody says no, you're like, oh, well, I'm going to do that anyways, you're going to be operating at a higher temperature, right? And so, you're likely to come up with a more unusual idea, right? Something other people haven't thought of. You're likely to see, beyond the trees in the forest.
That's great. That's great. And I appreciate you giving that clarification around temperature and you provided a great example in your book around, on one end of the spectrum, the greatest probability to follow the words I love probably will be you based on the number of instances that you follows I love. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you want more chaotic, random responses, it be what would normally follow I hate. So having that awareness of the temperature gauge, and I think you described it as finding the right climate. So when we think about applications in an organization and teams coming together to unlock some creativity, but also observe the boundaries or the rules, talk a little bit about some of your recommendations for putting those rules in place so that, and the time, because you have an interesting, I think, point of view around with some experience references in history to when rules should have been more stringent and led to catastrophes, or when rules maybe should have been a little bit more like guidelines or barriers to create some breakthroughs. So talk a little bit about that.
So, and I think this has such contemporary relevance because we don't seem to learn our history lessons very well or be able to see the analogies between things that have happened in the past happen
We
today,
keep talking about it and then they happen again and we're like, wonder
and then they
why,
happen
like,
again.
how did
So,
it manifest again?
so human beings have a psychological effect called reactance, which is that when we are told there's a ban on something, many people, not all people, but many people will have a very strong reactive response, right? And, you might even see it, notice it, like when you're reading, and, you read an article in a magazine and then you're like, oh, no, I disagree with that opinion, right? So that's reactance. And the way that we've seen this play out in history is through the era of Prohibition, which ran from 1920 to 1933. And so I was really interested in this period of time because I wanted to see what human beings did in the face of a very clear prohibition, right? And this was like the best case study ever. And, what we saw is that, yes, there were certainly people who abstained from alcohol. Those were the rule followers. Many of them had very strict religious beliefs that they were already following. So to add not drinking alcohol into that was like a natural extension, right? Those might have been people who really enjoy following recipes, right? As a kind of persona. But we also had people at I want to say the higher, not the highest, right? Because we all know about the Al Capones of the world who just, irreverently broke all the rules. We had people who creatively broke the rules. And one of them was the Behringer family. They had a winery. And in order to continue their livelihood, they had to figure out a way of making a living. And so they figured out that within the rules, they could make these things called raisin bricks. And raisin bricks were basically just like a block of dried raisins, and they would ship them out, and those raisins would ferment. And so if you combine them with water, they would turn into wine, right? So it was not illegal for them to ship raisin bricks. They even put this very cheeky prohibition on the packaging that said whatever you do, don't mix this with water. Right? Which, of course, that's why people are buying them. So, I just think it's it was when I read that story, I'm like, this is so classic, right? We've seen this play over and over again with, you could apply it to marijuana, you could apply it to abortion, right? Whenever you tell people no, they will find a creative way around it. And so I really think that part of my audience for this book is legislators. You need to understand how our minds work creatively across the full temperature spectrum when you are thinking about imposing regulations, right? Think about how do you follow? Do you follow the speed limit? Another example from my own life is, I was always responsible for putting up signs telling people how to behave in certain areas on our campus, right? My favorite one are the no smoking signs, right? Whenever you put up a no smoking sign, you are going to see smokers. It's like they gravitate to the no smoking sign because if you are still smoking in this day and age, you probably are on the higher temperature end of the spectrum, right? You're probably not a rule follower. So if you're not going to follow the rules with your health, you are not going to follow the rules with a sign in an urban environment, right? So I think for me, this is just very insightful, not only for people in terms of like coming up with business strategies, but also in terms of regulation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, related to that, the framework that you explore that you touched on in the beginning might be a place for a starting point. So what I'm thinking about is organizations that want to explore this with their team. I think your framework provides some ideas for those leaders to get started.
Okay, so I think in terms of bringing this into companies and like really making this work for teams is thinking about the fact that if you have a problem that you need your company to solve, and one of the ones that I use in the quiz is, what do you do if you are asked to help your company save money, right? What's the first thing that you're going to do? And what I found is that people start that problem in very different places, right? Some people will want to go back in time, look at the history. Some people will like start with the data, right? Some people will like do a SWOT analysis, right? Like strengths and weaknesses, like look at everything all together. Some people will just like start by brainstorming. And so I think that what leaders can do is they can kind of, instead of giving a single problem to solve in a prescriptive way of solving it, leverage the different thinking styles of everyone in your company, right? Because by doing that, you're really going to get that full perspective. And the caution there is not to do it by role. So don't expect that your CFO is going to be the one who is only the person responsible for data, right? Don't expect that the creative people in the graphic design department are the only ones thinking about brand, right? And I think if we can break down some of those disciplinary silos and really let people operate from their thinking styles, their cognitive styles, rather than the job description, we're going to get a lot more potential out of our teams.
I agree. And I just really appreciate the manner that you invite people to explore where they are on that spectrum. So for those of you who have not read Lori's book yet, there is a quiz in there. So you can go in and take a quiz and discover where you are. I am the entertainer for anybody that is curious, and somehow I'm not surprised by that. But I'm also thinking, how can leaders maybe feel comfortable about putting the right parameters around the exploration of AI tools or problem solving with AI tools? Because I do think you do have a good perspective on, again, the context or the setting for what it is, what the problem is that you're trying to solve.
So, I think that we are at a point where, AI is going to be ubiquitous very soon. It used to be that if you needed or you wanted to use an AI application, you would have to find it yourself as an individual, figure out how to use it, figure out the best tools for your particular work, right? And there wasn't widespread corporate adoption. And we are just this year, I think, finally starting to see that change for a couple of different reasons. I think one, companies are starting to put money into training budgets and realizing that this is a mindset shift. The tool is easy, but figuring out how to use the tool is complicated. And then the other thing is, we've got a Microsoft and Google, which are, right up there in the AI arms race. And, just building those little tools into people's day-to-day interactions with products they've already been using, right? So, I think we're going to see this like major groundswell now move to, everybody is going to have access to AI, whether or not they choose to use it or not. You may or you may not have a choice. So in that world, I think it's important for us to think about what are humans really good at doing and what is AI good at doing and where do we co-collaborate? And some of the things that we always assumed humans are good at doing, like being creative, we're now starting to see that machines are competing, right, for that territory. And so I think really learning, and I think this is a personal use case. Every person is going to use AI differently. There are an infinite number of ways you can use the technology. I compare it very much to the era of the Excel spreadsheet, right? And, right now, can you think of a single thing you do in your business where you are not using a database, right? Like there's nothing, right? Everybody uses a database in one way, shape, or form. And so I think if we think of AI that way, right? Some people are going to use it to do math. Some people are going to use it to keep track of their grocery list. Some people are going to use it to, look at data that they gathered from social media, right? Some people might use it as a brainstorming tool to play in a repository. So, I think this is what I try and teach with AI is, if you like writing, don't use AI to write, right? Use it to do the things that you don't like. I think also it's like the perfect technology for polymaths, right? And for building empathy. So, there might have been a job that you were really interested in, but you didn't have the skill set to do. You can now teach yourself pretty easily, right? In a self-directed way by just, starting a conversation with a large language model. I have taught myself how to code. I I loved doing that when I was in the fourth grade, but that career path was not even something people considered, particularly for girls at the time. So I'm like playing catch up. And, I'm not coding any like, major enterprise level applications right now, but, I am building AI into products. I am able to like write little GPTs for myself that can communicate back and forth with my Google Calendar so I can like voice my request to like schedule a play date at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So, a little bit of knowledge in this era goes a long way. And I think this is going to be, I think we're having a renaissance again, right? Where people are going to have more than one role, right? More than one set of skills, and more easily be able to navigate between them.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciated listening to you and hearing some of your insights. And you and I have had the opportunity to have conversations before this, and both very curious about how we can help organizations navigate this change and leaders navigate this change. So I'm excited that you were able to join me today. And we have a couple of treats for our listeners out there. So the first one is that Lori does a wonderful training, and I'll let Lori, you say a few words about that and what you're offering to our listeners today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I run 2 monthly boot camps, an introductory level and then a more advanced level for those people who are ready to build little no-code applications. And I am offering a 20% discount to anybody who in the next 30 days decides that they are interested in taking a course. And you can find that information on my website.
Awesome. And you can put in the code Sentient20 and you will be able to qualify for that discount. So thank you so much for your generosity. And in addition, Lori and I and our respective companies are partnering to explore how we can bring different types of workshopping into organizations. So Lori does this, our team does a lot of workshopping. And so the power of the two companies, we believe that there's a great connection to provide leaders a starting point for reflecting on how to get their teams engaged more proactively with this and how to put some structure around it, as well as how to help prepare the organization for change and navigate through that. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for tuning in this session. We really enjoyed exploring this topic with Lori. We're grateful that, Lori, you took the time today. If you haven't read the book, I highly encourage. It's interesting. It's engaging. I even love the stories about your family and the trivia nights, Lori. So thank you so much again and have a great day, everyone.